Welcome back, everybody. You're listening to Cut the Shit, a podcast series that aims to take a closer look at the impact of the IT industry, both the good and the bad. Cut the Shit is brought to you by Plow Networks, a managed IT services company based just outside Nashville, Tennessee. I'm Bryan, EVP of Products and Services here at Plow, and I'll be your host for this series. I'll ask questions, and with the help of our guests, try to dig deep on some of the key challenges we all face dealing with IT. So with that, let's cut the shit and get started. Hi, everyone. I know I said I might not be doing this anymore, but here I am again, riding solo, just like that old rap song. I'm recording this on the weekend, which is a bit weird for me. It feels a little bit like doing a school project or something. And since school did just start back, I guess that kind of makes sense. But I'm going to press on because I have a pretty interesting grab bag of topics to cover today. But before we jump in, I want to remind you of a few upcoming topics that we haven't gotten to yet, but that we're going to before the end of the year. The first one is this idea of differing perspectives or gathering different perspectives on how non-IT executives think about and value technology. I feel like that might be a good use of our time to talk to some business folks about how they think about technology, how do they value it, both within their own companies and just kind of conceptually. And then, of course, the couple of others we talked about before, the black hat versus white hats in the hacking world and sort of what that's all about. And then we've got an interview with a female CEO of a tech company that serves the needs of disabilities. That they've got a really interesting story. I'm still trying to get that on the books, but I think that one's going to be a lot of fun. So with that, let's jump in. In honor of back to school, since we already talked about that a little bit, I'm going to go back to my childhood for a minute. Don't worry, this isn't a couch session, but and it'll make sense, I think. As a child of the late 70s, early 80s, I grew up watching Schoolhouse Rock, the Schoolhouse Rock shorts between cartoons on Saturday mornings. For you youngsters out there, you used to only be able to see cartoons on Saturdays, so it was a big deal. And these were pretty cool. They're famous. I know everybody knows about them. Some are more famous than others. I'm Just Bill, probably the most famous, on and on. But they had this one. It was this kind of hippie song about the number 3. 3, it's a magic number. I don't really get that one so much, but I remember it. In fact, I can remember all the words to the songs, which is kind of weird, even though because it wasn't a very good song. But in honor of that song, and since school has just started back, figured it made sense, I'm going to cover 3 topics today. The first one is inflation and what to do about it, if anything. And then I'll get to the other 2 after we knock this one out. But I thought what I'd do on inflation since, let's face it, the media's beat this one to death. It's a huge topic right now. Lots and lots of people are talking about it. So there's very little I'm going to be able to do to, add something interesting to that particular I have no insights on inflation. I don't have any predictions on it. More just looking at it from the perspective of where I sit, and in particular, our company and what we're experiencing, and wondering, we're thinking about some ways to try to deal with that. And I was just curious if others are thinking about this. In fact, I'm sure you are, if you're thinking similarly or if you're thinking different. And if you're thinking different or you're struggling, maybe this will be helpful. But so with that, when I thought about it in terms of how inflation is affecting us, not infecting, we've heard enough of that word in the past couple of years, how it's affecting us, there's really kind of 3 areas I thought of that made that where we're seeing it probably the most specifically. And the first is just, we've seen some across the board increases in prices from some of our suppliers. And I'm guessing that you guys have probably seen that as well. Some of those may be, directly related to companies' internal costs going up. Some of it is probably just opportunistic. If prices are going up all over the board, it's a good time to raise prices, right? If you're in the business of selling something to somebody, because if everybody else is raising prices, you probably, I use the expression, get away with it, but it's probably okay. You won't get as much pushback if everyone else is raising prices too. So we're both seeing, these across the board increases. And then of course, we're seeing increased prices on, just consumer goods and commodities, stuff that we're having to buy. And again, I know that everybody is experiencing that. And frankly, there's not a ton we can do about it other than, just pay attention to it and try to maybe look for other ways to tighten the belt here and there to sort of offset that if you can. And then the last area, and there's been a lot of talk about this too, and I think this will probably be more relevant to the second topic I'm going to cover today, and that's we've seen pressure from in terms of inflation on salaries and wages, and those are we're not sure if that's macro or if it's related to competitors or, bidders for talent around technology, tech talent that's around us, because we're based in Nashville, Tennessee. It's a hot market right now. There's some interesting things going on around us in terms of companies who are looking to hire and hire aggressively. And so that has certainly had an impact on everybody's ability to hire at various levels, down to the sort of tier one level up, and on up the food chain all the way to the, to senior level folks. So those are sort of the three areas where we're seeing the biggest impact of inflation. And again, I'm not talking about my personal life or any of that stuff. All that stuff is there. And again, there's plenty of conversation around that, thinking of it more within the context of our own business and in yours as well, as you operate inside your company. And so, what do you do about that, really? I mean, or is there anything to do other than just try to go along and get along? And I think the answer is probably some of both. I think the first thing is probably, one thing I think I don't know if we'll probably never learn this lesson, but I keep thinking that maybe we will, is at some point and I mean the collective we, not Plow Networks or your company or anybody else, but we as a society need to probably admit that forecasting in terms of its ability to really predict the future, it really doesn't work. It's basically impossible. It doesn't mean you can't. Now, when I say that, it doesn't mean you just throw up your hands and you just go day to day, but to expect that we're going to know what the world looks like a year from now or 2 years from now is a fool's game, right? So at the very least, you need to have some sort of a probability on that and be hedging against the percentage of that probability that your prediction is wrong. And I don't think we've done a lot of that as a business culture. Certainly not from an economics perspective. If you look at our approach on things, we've been in this incredibly low rate environment for a long time, and I think most people just considered that was just going to be the way it was forever. And in fact, we know that's what people were saying, because you can go and look and you can see the quotes, and that clearly was not the case. They were wrong. And a couple of people have said they were wrong. Others have said maybe they weren't wrong, or here's why they were only sort of wrong, or something like that. But whatever, I'm not in the game of predicting, so it doesn't matter. But for us as a company, we do have to predict. We every day we have to predict, because certain things in the kinds of investments that we have to make as a company, and I'm sure that you have to make in your company, are not things that are just day to day. And the best answer, the simplest example for us, is hiring, right? Hiring new people is not something you can just do. If you need a new person today, you don't get somebody started and they go full tilt tomorrow, right? There's a significant lag time in terms of finding a person, getting them onboarded, getting them trained and up and contributing. The flip side is, if at some point you think you need them, your forecast says you need 10 people, and so you go hire 10 people, and it turns out you only need 5. It's not that easy to just get rid of people. I mean, despite the fact that we're not a union shop and people are working at will and all that kind of stuff, it's not that simple, right? These aren't widgets in that sense. And so having to try to figure out where you're going with some kind of forecasting is critical, but knowing what that looks like, and being, pretty conservative about that, and having a lot of humility around what it entails, I think is important, because if not, you're going to get yourself into trouble, either by not hiring enough, not hiring anybody, or having a way to hire anybody, or hiring too many people, both of which are bad. So, I think that, that dealing, being really honest with ourselves and being very, having a lot of humility around our ability to forecast the future, I think is really important. And so kind of downstream from that, there's a couple of things that we're trying to do, right? So we're continually trying to seek out operating methods that aren't as dependent on predicting the future, right? And so is there a way for us to match spending to revenue where possible? And there are some things you can do. You can leverage outsourcing for some of that, or contracts with partners that have variable income based on or your expenses spin up if you get a contract, that sort of thing. But that's really, you can't do everything that way. The idea that you can, at least in our business, isn't going to work, because we do want to have a group of folks that work with us over the long time, that are part of our team, that are ingrained in our culture, that kind of stuff. And that doesn't lend itself well to what I just described. So, that is a challenge for sure. I do think we are, we live in a world where multi-year contracts and locking people in is pretty common. And we even have some long-term contracts, although not that many. And we're having fewer and fewer every day because we want our customers to basically be doing business with us because they want to, not because they have to. That is a recipe for frustration and anger from your customers if they're unhappy with your business, but with your service as a service provider, and yet they still have to keep paying you, right? That is not the place anybody wants to be. And so we're trying to work around that as best we can within the construct of our business. And that part, does make some of this trickier. But hey, look, if we'll get to in kind of my second topic. If you're good at what you do and you're adding value, right, regardless of what's happening in the outside world, you've got a fighting chance to build and sustain long-term relationships with customers. And that has to be what you hang your hat on, I think, at the end of the day. And I think at Plow, that's what we're trying to do. And I'm sure, those of you listening are probably in that same boat, thinking about how do you sustain long-term relationships with people if you're in a B2B kind of environment. Really in B2C as well. How do you get repeat customers? How do you keep having consumers come back to you, keep buying from you over and over and over again, right? That's what you're looking for. And I think the last thing we're trying to do, and this is sort of it's a little bit counterintuitive, but not really, is this idea of doing less better. And what that means is, rather than being, if you're a service provider, rather than having 15 services that you do pretty well, or you do them okay, can you figure out how to do 6 or 7 really, really well, right? That leverage your capabilities, that leverage your people as best you can, that you feel like you really are adding the most value to the relationships that you have. If you can do that, over time, I think you make more money, and you hedge. That's a great way to hedge against things like inflation or recessions or other things, right? Because if you're really good and you're doing something that's creating a lot of value for people, they're going to have a hard time, parting ways with you because you're so important to them, right? And that's really where you want to be as a product or service provider. So I think those are the things, none of that's very comforting. It's not like there's some great solution to the situation in terms of inflation. And the plus side, I guess, if you're a company who's raised your prices because of inflation, then you've been able to grow your revenue, right? But your costs are going up at the same time. So it's sort of it's a little bit of a fool's game in that sense. It doesn't mean people shouldn't try to raise their prices. But the point is, it's almost always because costs are going up. So the net, what's hitting the bottom isn't really changing all that much. There's still the spread's the same. So, I think I've kind of beat the horse on that. So we'll go to, it did, as I mentioned a couple of times in there's, this idea of particularly around finding good talent and keeping it and building longer term relationships, I think folds into this second topic, which came from, it's based on an article I read in the Wall Street Journal a few days ago. It was on September 9th. And for those of you, if you're not a sports fan, you don't care about college football, bear with me. I'll make this as painless as I can for you, because the article was about college football, but it's directly relevant to what we're talking about, I think, around finding and keeping talent. And it was an article about college football's transfer system. And if you don't know anything about it, basically, it used to be that if you played college sports, it was very difficult to transfer to another school. You had to give up a full year of eligibility. You had to ask your coach for permission. I mean, there were a lot of restrictions. And so players didn't move from school to school very often at all. Well, that has changed dramatically in the last couple of years. And now it's basically, it's pretty much you can pretty much transfer whenever almost at any time you want now, with some limits, but not many. And so players are taking advantage of it. Players are moving all over the place now. And there've been a lot of high profile stories, particularly around, I'll call marquee players, quarterbacks, or, highly visible players from big schools going to other places and immediately, playing at another school. Well, this journal article was interesting because they sort of delved in and looked. This transfer process has a portal, so a player has to submit information to the NCAA, get approved, and they can go to the other school. So there's a data set on who's moving where, how many have done it, what position they play, all that kind of stuff. And so this author from this article has basically looked at all the data and done some analysis, and the findings are interesting. They're not counterintuitive, but they're counter to what you hear in terms of the volume of media coverage. And what the data show is that the primary movers, the players who are moving from school to school are in general not starters. They're mostly reserves, right? They're guys that are and gals who are at one school who aren't getting playing time, and so they're transferring to another school to try to get playing time, which makes sense. They're athletes, they want to play. The other thing that's interesting about that is almost not exclusively, but most of them are trading down in terms of brand, school brand or prominence to get playing time. Meaning, if you're a reserve at a Big Ten school, if you transfer, you're most likely going to a mid-major school. You're going to a smaller school that's not in as big a conference, so you can play, right? Which again, makes perfect sense, right? If you want to get on the field and play, this gives you the chance to do that. And the biggest driver of transfers, or the reason people are transferring, the primary reason, in addition to playing time, is a coaching change, right? And so you say, okay, how is any of that freaking relevant to, technology and recruiting or keeping good people for your company? Not even just technology people, anybody. And I think the most, the number one thing that it says to me is, first of all, there is no transfer portal for companies, right? There's no easy way for us to track who's moving where, and for us to go find people who are basically raised their hand and said, yeah, I want to move, and this is what my skill set looks like, and all that kind of stuff. I mean, there's LinkedIn, there's job postings, all that kind of stuff. Those are sort of a proxy for it, but it's not that clean and neat. So the idea of finding talent that's out there that wants to come to your company, I think we would all agree is a tricky proposition. It's hard. It takes time. It's expensive. Maybe you use recruiters. If not, you have your managers or your internal people, playing recruiter, trying to find people. I mean, it's a hard job to find good people. And so retention is critical, right? If you can keep the good people that you have, you don't have to go hire more people, right? And you can avoid that churn and that treadmill. And there's one part of the story was they were looking at the stats of schools who had lots of transfers and then contrasting that with a couple of the major, two of the most successful college football programs of modern, in the last 10 years are Alabama and Clemson. And you can make people have all kinds of arguments for why that's the case, why they are as successful as they are. But they are also both of those schools have some of the lowest number of transfers, both out and in, of any schools in the sort of the Power 5 conferences, the big power schools. And they interviewed someone from Clemson, and this guy's argument was, look, we are trying to build a program here, and we want guys to be here for a while. We have a specific culture that we are trying to instill in our players, and we can't do that if we're constantly having new players, every year that are only here for a year. Okay? And so that, on its face makes a lot of sense. I'm not saying everybody can do that, but I think that is what we're all sort of striving for, is can we build a culture as a company so that when we hire people, we give them, they have a lot of, they have opportunities, right? It's a place they want to be. We've got the kind of culture that includes compensation, benefits, training opportunities, learning, growth, autonomy, the ability to get good at something, the ability to, to feel like the work that they do matters, right? All of those things play into this sort of, cocktail of what's culture, right? And we all can say we have it, we can point to it, but it's not a formula. It's not this plus this plus this equals good culture, but it's a mix of those things for sure. And I think that what we see from college football gives back to us a pretty clear picture of this. Retention is critical for for companies. If you don't want to spend all of your time recruiting, right? You got to give your players, use the term players for your employees, both your technical people and your non-technical people, frankly, you got to give them playing time, right? They have to have a chance to grow. They've got to have a chance to stretch. They've got to have a chance to take some risks and to try to get better, right? Because that's the proxy for playing time, I think, for a regular employee. And then the last piece is managers matter a whole lot, right? Just like coaches. Managers leave, or if managers are bad, players are going to, they want to leave that school. They don't want to stay there. I think our company and your company are exactly the same. If I'm a shitty manager, people don't want to work for me, right? And so they're going to leave. They're going to go somewhere else. I mean, there's the old saying about people quit managers, not companies. And while I don't know that that's 100% true, it's probably 75 to 80% true for sure, right? I mean, there's other reasons why people leave, but that's a big one. And we want to make it about money. And I'm not saying money matters a lot. I mean, let's face it, we all work because we need the money. I mean, it's not, that's a given, but it's not the only thing that matters. In fact, I would argue there's a lot more going on underneath the surface for motivation or why we do what we do beyond the paycheck, particularly once you get above a certain level of income, and that level of income is a lot lower than we think it is. We want to make it about that because that's easy. It's quantifiable, simple. Unfortunately, it's just not that simple. So figuring out a way to, give you guys playing time, give your guys and gals playing time, and making sure that you have the right managers in place is the best way to give yourself a chance to be more like Clemson or Alabama and less like a place that's having 15 or 20 people leave every season and having to bring in 15 or 20 who got to play right away, right? Because that is a constant. That's the equivalent of turnover. It's the equivalent of having to fire or having people quit and constantly backfill. All right, so that's that's my tortured sports analogy for the day. For those of you again who hate sports, I hope you were able to suffer through that and find that it didn't completely waste your time. The third bullet or the third item today I wanted to talk about, again, once more from an article from the Wall Street Journal. Not that the Wall Street Journal is the only thing to read, but I just found a couple in here in the last couple of weeks that I thought were sort of interesting. And this one it caught my eye because it was something about predictive maintenance. And I actually thought it was a misprint at first. I was like, well, they must be talking about preventive maintenance because that's what I've always heard, PM, preventive maintenance, like what you do on your car, getting oil changes and rotating your tires and that kind of stuff. But no, it was predictive maintenance. And what's going on, the article it was about industrial companies. These are manufacturing companies that have machines that make stuff. Okay. So that's what the article was about. Mostly big manufacturing companies. And they've had a lot of, trying to maintain those machines in these factories has a constant challenge for them. Obviously, they're making significant investments in this machinery. They're trying to run it all the time or as much as they can. And they want to extend the useful life of that. They want to, maximize the investment, maximize the uptime so that they can get as much production out of it. All that makes perfect sense. And my assumption was they had, preventive maintenance schedules where someone came in and looked at the machine and, changed out the filters or greased I don't know. I'm not an industrial guy. So all that just sounded terrible, but you get what I'm saying. I had an assumption that it was a manual intervention on a schedule. Okay. And I think that's there. That no question about it. But what the article was about was this idea of predictive maintenance. And there are software companies that are now using kind of the Internet of Things. They're putting sensors on these machines and are actually monitoring the sounds that the machines make. And they have a database. They're using kind of machine learning and some AI to then listen to those sounds and compare them against their database of sounds that these machines make when they're like doing well, when they're fine, and the machines they make when they're starting to struggle, right? And I never really thought about that a machine might sound one way and then the sound would change over time until it broke or something went bad, a part was going bad. But that's basically the gist of what they're doing. Now that's maybe overly simplistic, but I don't think so based on what I read. And I was like, wow, that sounds kind of primitive, just listening to the sounds and then, translating that into here's where it maybe is in its life cycle or the potential for something to break. But it seems to be working based on the data. The companies that are using these software systems are having real success proactively coming in and fixing things based on these algorithms telling them, hey, you got a problem with machine number 12 over there. You probably need to do something about it because if you don't, it's going to break. But then I got to thinking about it. I was like, well, we already have that in technology, right? We've been doing this for a while, right? And the IT equivalent or the technology equivalent of it is pretty simple, right? This is device monitoring, right? Where we've got software on endpoints or on infrastructure machines, switches, routers, that kind of thing, that are constantly updating software because we don't want the software to get bad. We don't have something listening to the sound that the actual devices make. But again, I guess maybe you could do that, but it's not really necessary, right? This is more looking at the software itself or the machine itself, and then trying to proactively, again, not on a set schedule. It's not like we're going in every 90 days and making a change on the machine, although you can do that. But for example, antivirus software is constantly updating a machine and looking at, is it being patched the way it's supposed to do? Is it checking in when it's supposed to do? And that's really unique. It's sort of a mass customization approach. It's unique to that particular machine. It's not on hey, every 90 days you got to go to Jiffy Lube and change your oil, right? It's based on it's getting some feedback from the machine itself. And so, that's happening on the device side. It's happening on the software system side. So like networks, constantly monitoring network devices and traffic to look for patterns and seeing potential issues around, if you're having throughput problems, or if it looks like, now again, this is a different kind of maintenance, right? This isn't go fix wires. So for example, I'm not saying that we have, in terms of network monitoring, it means we can tell if a wire is bad. That's a different kind of issue, but I'm using it sort of as a proxy for the network itself. Because at the end of the day, whether the wire is bad or not, generally the wire is not the problem, right? It's usually the actual software and the delivery of the packets themselves in the case of network connectivity. But this applies to, collaboration software, identity, like making sure that people are in the right groups, making sure that they're, where they're supposed to be. If there's, looking for ways of identifying potential fraudulent activity, all kinds of cybersecurity or anti-fraud mechanisms would fall into this bucket. And then even the apps themselves, looking at application health, having a set of data about an application. Is it performing the way it's supposed to? Are database calls happening when the way they're supposed to? And you can track those. You can track that over time and see trends that would allow you to predict, hey, look, we maybe have a problem on the database side. We need to upgrade that. We need to expand its capabilities. We need to refactor. There's a bunch of things that could come from that. So I just found it interesting that what's happening on the industrial side really is sort of mirroring what technology has been doing for a while and keeps, frankly, getting better and better at. Although one area that I don't think we're doing a good job at, that we're putting some cycles into, and if you're a buyer, you should be asking your team or asking your providers about this as well. And that's what I'd call SaaS usage or optimization monitoring, right? So SaaS subscription services almost always have, either a consumption model where you pay by the drink, if you want to use that expression, right, based on how much you use, or a per user or a per license model based on some volume, right, a number of heads or a number of machines or something like that. Okay, fine. So at some point you got to buy that, right, and commit to some number. Well, and oftentimes on the consumption side, you have the opportunity to buy in bulk, right, buy things in advance, and rather than buying 100 gigabytes of storage, as it happens, you go ahead and buy 100 in advance and you get it cheaper on the per gigabyte. Okay, that's an obvious model. But how do you know how much to buy, right? And how do you know if you're buying the right amount? And what if things change, right? If you've got some flexibility, if you're not locked into a longer term contract around your SaaS subscriptions, what if your business changes? Back to the conversation we were having earlier about scaling cost to revenue, what about just scaling usage to spend? Right? If you've got something you're paying on a per head basis and your head count varies, are you able to peg your SaaS usage to that? And the answer to that is perhaps, but it certainly won't happen if you don't have some way of monitoring and evaluating that data to give you the ability to do what to do sort of like predictive maintenance around this kind of thing, right? And I think we're going to see more of that going forward. SaaS spend keeps going up. It's expensive oftentimes, even though it can feel cheap on a per user basis. But if you got a lot of users and you're growing, that number can go up quick on you. And this can be everything from, B2B services, back office stuff, Microsoft 365, Salesforce, your, online banking services. If you're a bank, it could be, there's a million different HR services, ERP systems, all this stuff is now, has been converted to a SaaS model, and everyone, celebrates it. But again, it can get really expensive on you if you're not watching it. And what I'm talking about is, are you able to really feel like you're optimizing what you're spending in those systems? And I think that's where usage monitoring and optimization, I think there's a real opportunity for that. And I'd encourage you, if you haven't thought about that, or if you have and you don't feel like you guys are doing a good job of it, poke around, ask your partners, ask your colleagues in other companies, what are they doing? See if there's a way for you to tighten that up, at least to have an idea. If nothing else, you'd be able to say, to yourself and to your colleagues, hey, look, I know we're spending a lot on Salesforce, but here's some data to support why that's a good use of our dollar. Right. And I don't know that I don't know that that's something that people are really doing a good job of yet. And we're trying to figure that out on behalf of our customers and for ourselves, because we are consumers of SaaS services just like you guys are. And so I think it's a good exercise for all of us to think about. So with that, I'm gonna wrap it up, and that's all I've got for today. In the spirit of 3, this is my 3rd solo recording, so I'm hoping that the 3rd time's a charm. If you enjoyed it, or if you didn't, please drop me a line at cuttheshit@plow.net and tell me why I did or I didn't do a good job, or why you did or didn't enjoy it. Also, if you've got any topic or interview ideas, we've been doing this now for a little over a year. We feel like we're kind of understand what we're doing. We're still learning, and we'd still like to hear from others to say, hey, here's an idea, or here's something we think you guys ought to think about covering. And so we'd love to hear from you on that front. Okay, that's all I've got for you this week. Take care, and we'll talk to you in 2 weeks. We hope you enjoyed this episode. If you are enjoying the podcast, we'd appreciate it if you would become a subscriber wherever you get your podcasts. And if you could rate and review the show on Apple Podcasts and Spotify, that would really help us out. Or you can just go old school and tell your friends, your family, your colleagues, and hell, anybody else who you think might want to hear something like this to listen in. If you're on social media, make sure to follow us on Twitter. Our handle is @cuttheshit_pod. We are also on TikTok @cuttheshitpod, all one word, where we post lots of clips from the podcast. And last but not least, you can also watch the YouTube version of the show on our YouTube channel @Plow Networks. Until next time, take care and have a great day.